There are countless artists whose names resonate within music itself. From the Beatles in the 60s to Nirvana's surge in popularity in the 90s, some bands are so seminal that almost any record of theirs could be defined as great. On the other hand though, some bands have made their way to the top tier with only one solid effort to their name. These artists are the few outliers of the music industry who etch their name into the canon with one classic album. However, whether it was due to a breakup or a severe drop in quality, these bands were never able to capture the power behind their first mainstream hit. And yeah, even though some of these bands had some belters after their first surge in popularity, they will always be living in the shadow of the record that got them their first big break. So I'm not saying everything else they recorded was bad or anything, it just didn't hit that top tier classic level. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 classic bands who only had one classic album. Number 8, Dire Straits. As the 80s started to get underway, your star power had to be larger than life if you wanted to be seen. Even if you could put together a bunch of great tunes into one package, it didn't mean much if you had to compete with the neon-coloured contemporaries dominating the charts. For all the more fabricated pop of the day though, Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits strapped on a headband and dominated the entire rock sphere. Though the band had already had a hit with Sultans of Swing in the 70s, it wasn't until they made Brothers in Arms that people really started to pay attention. Pulling from the synth revolution taking place as well as resting on their laurels as mellow rockers, the band turned in some of the best feel-good tunes of the decade, from Walk of Life to the unofficial anthem of MTV in Money for Nothing. It was a great time to be Dire Straits, but the glory dissipated as the band went on to new projects. After a few more stabs at a full album, the band went their separate ways, with Mark Knopfler going on to be one of the most acclaimed guitarists in the world. Dire Straits have more than a few classic songs under their belt, but when talking about their recorded output, Brothers in Arms is the fullest album experience we ever got. Number 7, The Stone Roses. While most of the 80s sound needed to have a certain size to it, the entire rock scene was in for a shake-up by the end of the decade. Instead of the heavy hitters being hair metal bands or synth rock, bands were bubbling up from the underground that became known as alternative acts. Though grunge would get its time in the sun first, the Stone Roses laid the groundwork for what Britpop would later be down the road. This self-titled album from the band is an absolute treat, with every other song having a brilliant vocal melody along with the psychedelic instrumentation. It's great stuff, with one iconic tune after another. The band may have started their career off with a bang, but it quickly went south once the initial glory faded. After rubbing arms with other Britpop bands like Oasis, the band's attempt at a second album with Second Coming ended up being a bit haphazard, with some great tunes that weren't grasped by the public. The band's debut is definitely in the conversation when it comes to the best alternative records of all time, but it's a shame they couldn't capitalize on their momentum. Number 6, Billy Idol. Billy Idol was an artist that seemed tailor-made for MTV. After winning the hearts of punk fans all over the world with Generation X, his more exaggerated take on the punk formula made him the darling of the early days of music television. While his star was one of the brightest in those early days though, it may have ended up burning him in the process. While Idol's debut record started his career off strong with songs like White Wedding, it wasn't until his sophomore effort Rebel Yell that people really started to take notice. From the blistering title track to the more down-tempo ballad Eyes Without a Face, this album catapulted Idol to the top of the rock heap, with his videos constantly getting played on MTV. Even the standalone singles from this era like Dancing With Myself ended up becoming classics, but even Idol didn't realize that he was peaking way too fast. Though Idol still kept his signature style throughout the rest of the decade, he quickly became a caricature of the punk attitude, with songs like Cradle of Love feeling like they were more novelties of the glam era than sincere rock. Idol did try to distance himself from his typical sound on albums like Cyberpunk, but by the time the alternative movement came in, people had kinda stopped caring. Number 5, Steve Miller Band. Steve Miller has a rock and roll upbringing most musicians can only dream of. As he started coming up the ranks as a musician, his apprenticeship under Les Paul saw him learning from some of the greatest blues guitarists who ever lived. While Miller could have gotten by writing some of the most complex rock music ever made, his ability to write pop tunes wasn't too shabby either. I'm sure most people could hum a few bars of something like The Joker, but that was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to his star power. After embracing the large sound of the synthesizer, Miller locked himself away in a studio and wrote Fly Like an Eagle, which became one of the most essential records in the history of classic rock. From the title track to Take the Money and Run to Rockin' Me, almost every other track on there could have been a hit. After a record like that though, there also comes the unenviable task of topping it, which Miller admirably stepped up to face. Though Book of Dreams did have a few classics on it, the afterglow of Eagle was too thick in the air for people to pay too much attention. Fly Like an Eagle has enough hooks for any other band's entire career, but its star power ended up stifling the man who birthed it. Number 4. Beach Boys. From the moment they started their lush vocal harmonies, the Beach Boys always seemed to be destined for a singles act. But at some point along the way, Brian Wilson got the idea of a lifetime. Aiming to compete with the Beatles' album-centric productions, Wilson went into the studio and crafted Pet Sounds, which ended up becoming one of the most celebrated albums in rock history. Though the sound was still what you'd expect from these California surfers, the added touch of instrumentation made everything blossom out even more. Even the single from the sessions, Good Vibrations, is known as one of the greatest songs in the entire rock canon. I've already said that this is one of the best albums in rock, but it did take a toll on its creator, with Wilson going into a depression and suffering a mental breakdown as a result. The band would eventually try to venture further into psychedelic territory later on, but the results ended up being much more lackluster than people wanted to hear. By the time Summer of Love came around, it was clear Pet Sounds would never be matched. Number 3. Sex Pistols. If you're talking about a band that embodies everything great about the punk aesthetic, the Sex Pistols have to be your prime candidate. With a loose energy in their playing and some of the most venomous lyrics in the rock world, these guys were the crude answer to the more manufactured rock that had been the order of the day. Though the band were already off the rails at the best of times, they did keep it together long enough to create Nevermind the Bollocks. With songs like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen, the band captured the spirit of every disenfranchised youth of England who wanted to speak out against authority. And after this, things got off to a good start, but it was a different story once they decided to tour. Under the disastrous eye of Malcolm McLaren, the band made their way to the US but found themselves in absolute shambles, with Sid Vicious on a road to self-destruction and the band suffering from personality differences. After a layover of a few days, the band returned to England and quickly folded. We may only have Nevermind the Bollocks as a solitary album, but that was all the rock world needed to spark a new wave of punk music. Number 2. Boston. For as much great material as there was emerging from the rock world in the 70s, the overall sound of the production started to feel a little stale. Sure, bands like Blue Oyster Cult may have written some badass tunes, but the actual staying power got muddied by the sound of their records. Out of all the more extravagant acts of the day though, Boston's debut still sounds fresh even by today's standards. Being almost entirely the brainchild of guitarist Tom Scholz, the record has one hit after another, from the arena anthem More Than a Feeling to the bluesy groove of Smokin'. In addition to being just great songs, Scholz's use of keyboards, guitars, and homemade gear had a huge impression on the rock world moving forward. Any record this seminal should set up a band for a career of a lifetime, but it just ended up actually inadvertently killing their groove. By the time they got to making the record Don't Look Back, Boston had quickly gone from being sonic innovators to something of a one-trick pony. The songs ended up sounding so similar that the band actually called it Don't Look Back in the hopes fans would ignore the power of their debut. And that's because that debut is a big reason for rock's growth, but it did end up costing the band any further ambitions. Number 1. Derek and the Dominos. Coming off Cream, Eric Clapton was quickly being looked at as one of the first guitar gods. With a sound all of his own and some of the tastiest solos in rock history, Slowhand had enough fame to retire his name from rock altogether. While he seemed to have everything, Clapton's Unrequited Love led to one of his finest short-lived groups. Writing songs in tribute to George Harrison's wife Pattie Boyd, Clapton got a band together called Derek and the Dominos to record the tunes. Not only did these end up being some of the most celebrated songs of Clapton's career, but also showed him trading lead lines with the great Duane Allman on songs like Layla. This entire project could have been something huge, but sadly it was not to be. Shortly after going their separate ways, Duane Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident, taking a little bit of the magic with him. Deciding to retire the name, Clapton moved on to his solo career, where he would still see a good helping of hit songs. A guitar duet of this caliber is something we didn't know we needed, but the rock world should be thankful that we got it at least once. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Are there any classic bands that you love that only had one classic album? And what do you think about the rest of the output on this list? While you're down in the comments though, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.